Okay, thanks Matthew, and thanks everyone for coming. A bit about me. My name is Helen Hosein, and I work for a company called Softwire. I've been a project manager for nearly 10 years, and I've been at Softwire for the last year and a half or so. And at Softwire, we build bespoke software for various clients, and we like to tailor our projects to suit our clients' needs. So that means that we work with a wide range of methodologies and also a wide range of commercial models. So while I've been at Softwire, I've gotten a bit of experience with fixed price projects, and I've got a few things to share. One reason that I'm here giving this talk this evening is that I've been to a few of these meetups, and we tend to have all these great discussions about Agile principles and all the benefits of Agile, and all the great things that we can get out of our projects if we just use Agile. And then inevitably, someone puts up their hand and says, hang on, that's all well and good, but you haven't met the people that I have to work with. You don't know what it's like in my organization. We have this really stringent sign-off process. Or maybe they're saying, my clients have this really strict procurement process. Either way, whoever it is that's holding the purse strings just will not sign off a project unless there are certain constraints. Anyone here been there? Anyone been the guy putting up their hand and complaining about it? This is reality. This is what we're dealing with. Fixed price, fixed scope. You pay a set price, you get a set thing. You know exactly what you're getting. Even if maybe you wanted no mustard, maybe you wanted a gluten-free bun. Too bad, this is what you're getting. This is what we agreed to. This is how much you pay. So there are some problems with this, as I'm sure we all know. A few of the things that can go wrong. Sometimes it's bigger than you thought. Maybe the whole project is bigger than you thought it was. Maybe some of the individual stories are bigger than you thought, or just more complex. There might be emergent complexity, emergent functionality, or implied functionality. This can happen. Multiple interpretations of the scope. We went to all this trouble to define this fixed scope up front. And then when it comes time to implement things, the client has one idea of what it should mean, and you have a different idea. Or maybe there's different stakeholders on the client side that all have different ideas of what it should be. And this can slow you down, even if their interpretation isn't actually more costly than yours. The whole process of figuring it out will slow you down. In a fixed price, fixed scope project, we tend to assume that since everything's decided up front, we don't need to spend time doing analysis during the project. We don't budget for that. And that causes all kinds of problems. Here's another one. Often, a fixed price, fixed scope project also comes with a tight deadline. In fact, all projects seem to come with tight deadlines. Ask anyone when they want something. They want it yesterday. And how do we solve that? We over-resource the project. We have 4 people to change 1 light bulb because 9 women can have a baby in 1 month, right? By over-resourcing the project, we burn through the budget paying all these people to get a job not much faster, sometimes slower. Sometimes things can fall out of sync. Specifically, the payment schedule can be out of sync with the delivery of actual value. The payment schedule is set at the beginning. Sometimes you get all the money up front. Sometimes you get it all at the end. Most often you get it in tranches, which have nothing to do with when you actually get work done. They have more to do with the calendar. And when the payments are out of sync with delivering a value, with paying the bills, things can go wrong. And finally, fairly obvious one. When you fix everything up front, it's hard to adapt. Things can go wrong. Sometimes things simply change. And you can't keep up with that change because everything was assumed to be set up front. All of these problems probably sound familiar, not just because you've been on projects like this, but we thought we left all this behind, right? These problems all sound a bit, you know what I mean? I thought we were done with this. The Agile Manifesto came out nearly 15 years ago. Come on, guys, keep with the times. Why are we still doing this? So we say to ourselves, fine, it's not a waterfall project. It's a fixed price, fixed scope project, but it's not a waterfall project. Because even though we fixed the scope up front, there's nothing stopping us from chopping it up into little pieces and arranging all of those pieces into sprints and scheduling a daily stand-up meeting and declaring we are doing Agile. But does that make it an Agile project? Not necessarily. If you take a waterfall project and you chop it up into little pieces, you don't automatically get an Agile project. What you get is this. So what can we actually do? How do we get a fixed price project to run successfully while really genuinely being agile? I had this discussion with some of my colleagues at Softwire, and I happened to run it by our technical director, Matthew Richards, and he had a few ideas of variants of the fixed price commercial model that I think lend themselves really well to running agile projects. Matthew is currently working on a white paper. This is so hot off the press that it's not even on the press yet. He's still working on it, but it's about weighing up value versus certainty in various commercial models, and that's where he makes his suggestion of his 3 fixed price variations, and I'll run through them. The first one he calls fixed price, fixed points. To me, this is like a set menu. You get to choose a starter, you get to choose a main, you get to choose a dessert. You can't have 2 desserts and a main. It has to be one of each. You can swap out anything you like as long as it's within that structure. So if I decide I want the panna cotta instead of the apricot crumble, no problem. The price doesn't change. You can apply the same principle to a project by saying that the project is going to be this many points. And you can swap out any stories you like as long as they're roughly the same amount of effort, so the same point value. The assumption here, of course, is that 2 stories with the same point value are in fact equivalent, that 2 5-pointers are created equal. They have the same amount of risk associated, the same amount of effort associated with them. So you're not trading a filet for a salad. The other thing to consider, sorry, I need to check my notes. The other thing to consider is whether the value of a point remains constant over the duration of a project. Because if you've got something new that comes up and you've got to estimate it, and you call it a 5-pointer, is it really the same as a 5-pointer would have been at the start of the project? These things do add risk. They can be overcome by approaching it carefully, not just swapping things willy-nilly, and by making sure that it's a collaborative process with your clients or your stakeholders. Story time, I'll give you an example. A while ago, I worked on a fixed price project which involved upgrading a bespoke CMS that we had built previously for this client in order to accommodate a new type of content to support a new area of their business. well, not a new area, but they were new to this CMS. That area of the business had much, much more complicated data than the type of content that we'd been supporting before in our CMS. So the pages that we generated they had to be structured differently from the ones that we were generating previously. You could find everything you needed, but it was easy to get lost. So in the process of reviewing what we'd built so far, someone came up with an idea. Let's improve the navigation structure. Let's add some breadcrumbs at the top. It'll make it a lot easier for the users. The product owner thought that was brilliant, but we had to find a way to get it into the schedule. We did that by looking at the remaining stories that we had and finding an equivalent amount of points that were lower priority, that basically the product owner thought would not add as much value as the improved navigation. And we made this a collaborative process. We didn't just arbitrarily pick something and take it out. We talked about the risk involved, and we made sure that the project wasn't going to become any riskier or any costlier because of the swap. In the end, the client got what they wanted, everybody was happy, and that way we were able to adapt, to incorporate new ideas, something that's really important to Agile. Those swaps don't have to happen just when someone has a new idea or just at the end of the project or near the end of the project. They can happen regularly through the course of a fixed price project as part of your sprint planning. If you build it in to the natural life of the project, then it begins to feel a bit more agile by being more adaptable. Sort of dipping your toe in the agile water while still doing fixed price. The second commercial model that Matthew suggested is fixed price, fixed resource. So that's a bit like hiring a mixologist for the evening with a bar tab. You get this guy for the night, he'll mix anything you want, no menu required. But once the tab runs out, party's over. Fairly simple, right? In a way, it's a bit like running a time and materials or T&M project, but with a strictly fixed budget. I know this can be hard to sell. I've seen most people's knee-jerk reaction to this. You want to do what with my budget? You don't want me to fix the scope up front? What is everyone's worst nightmare when they don't get to fix their scope up front, but they have a tight budget? Worst nightmare? Anyone?
Overflows.
Overflows?
Yeah, they don't get what they need and they need to pay more. So they basically having all the risk themselves.
But if they haven't got any money to pay more?
They always have some money.
That's true, and that should probably be the fourth model. But I think it's similar to that. The one that I keep hearing, what everyone seems to be afraid of when they know that at some point they're going to run out of money, but they haven't fixed their scope. They're scared of an unfinished project. The money will run out. We've done some work. We haven't built anything useful. This, I think, is a good opportunity to remind people about continuous delivery. This is where continuous delivery can really shine. What is the main purpose of continuous delivery? What are we doing? We're making sure that every check-in is potentially releasable. That is the point. That's why we're all here. That's why we all signed up for London Continuous Delivery. And if every check-in is potentially releasable, you can stop a project at any point, even before the money's run out, and you've got something useful. There are no unfinished projects. Story time. I did a project not long ago with a client who was using a horrendous macro-filled Excel spreadsheet as a process tool. So they wanted to replace it with a nice shiny web app. But they weren't in the business of selling software. They only had so much budget to spend on this project. They just wanted to make their lives easier. And if they got something they could then sell on to other similar businesses, then fine. But the main objective was to meet their business needs within their very strict budget. We set up this project as exactly like this: fixed price, fixed resource. We had a small full-time team, and we followed XP, and we used continuous delivery on a weekly sprint basis, every week, meeting with the client and deciding what to build next. By the time they had used up their budget, they were really happy with what they'd gotten, because every week they got to specify exactly which pieces of the app we would build next, and they got to continuously get something they could use. They would sit in their offices and see that we'd push something new and start using it right away. That way, it's fully collaborative, it's fully agile. We did pure XP. The team was really happy, and we still did a fixed price project. This, by far, is my favorite of the 3 commercial models, and therefore I'm going to reiterate. Fixed price, fixed resource, plus continuous delivery is the way to go if you can sell that to your client or to your stakeholders. If you can't, I have one more commercial model to present to you. It's a hybrid. Fixed price, minimum deliverable. In this model, you've got a certain proportion of the budget that's allocated to a minimum deliverable, a must-have. It could be an MVP. It could just be the most basic functionality associated with your project. The rest of the budget is delivered in a fixed price, fixed resource type way, where it's basically time and materials, but you know where the spending stops. And that is for enhancements. Either making things better, adding in functionality that's not must-have but nice to have, just making things shiny. So you start with the basics, the minimum deliverable, and then you use the rest of the budget to fancy it up a bit. Another story. Recently, I did a project with a client that wanted to build a brand new native mobile app that it was really important to them that not only did it work well, but it looked really, really good. So the minimum deliverable was the basic app functionality. It loaded in the content, it rendered it correctly, it was navigable. And then we had a portion of the budget that we called UI sugar. That was allocated for making everything as super shiny as they wanted it. Their designers came up with a bunch of ideas. Some were quite slick, some were bonkers. We estimated them all. We prioritized them with the product owner, and then the developers sat side by side, literally pairing side by side with the designers to get the designs perfect. And as we went along, we kept checking in with the product owner, making sure that they were happy with what we were building, and figuring out which piece of UI sugar we should build next. By the end, we had an app that looked absolutely fabulous, and they were really happy that their sugar money had been well spent. So to recap, these are Matthew's 3 fixed price variants: fixed price, fixed points, fixed price, fixed resource, and fixed price, minimum deliverable, or as I like to think of them, the set menu, the bar tab, and the hybrid. So now I'll turn it over to you. Tell me some of your stories or ask me questions. Yep.
Who participates to determine all the point values? Is the development team together with a product owner, with business, or it's mainly technical architect or tech leads or project manager?
In my experience, oh yeah, thanks. Thanks for reminding me. So the question, if I understand it correctly, is who determines the point values of various stories, whether it's the development team or the business, or whether it's a collaboration. In my experience, it's usually the development team because they're the ones doing the estimating, but it's often collaborative with the product owner, with someone who understands the business needs, because they're usually things that you need to clarify in order to determine the exact point value of a story. Now, that said, the estimation process can have its issues, and there's the whole no estimates thing, and that's a completely separate talk. But that's the process that we usually follow, and that's the convention that a lot of organizations use when they're planning fixed price projects, because you have to start with something. And there are assumptions around it, one of which is that the point values will be accurate.
And what kind of scope you used to determine the point value? For example, the cost in the feature level or story level or work item level, fine-grained or course scope?
If you're doing, so the question was, what granularity do you use when determining the point value? If you're doing a really strict traditional fixed price, fixed scope project, then you probably want to get as granular as possible, because you don't expect to change anything and you want to make sure that everything is exactly right up front. And you're going to use those specs throughout the project anyway, because you're hoping not to do any more analysis. So it makes sense to spend the time getting it really granular and making everything really detailed. As you probably can tell, I don't advocate that. So if you're going to do something more like fixed price, fixed resource, where it's essentially time and materials, then it doesn't really matter how granular you make it. It's more for a general planning guide for the product owner to kind of decide what they want to work on first. But it's just like any other agile project. You can do it at the epic level and then just plan it out in detail as you go along.
Thank you.
Any other questions or any stories to share? Yep.
How common are fixed price, the fixed price model that you're talking about? How common is that in compared to non-fixed?
I think it's much less common. Sorry, when you say non-fixed,
Well,
you mean pure time and materials? Okay, sorry, I misunderstood your question at first. I think, no, I think you're... So I think a lot of organizations are moving more and more towards just doing everything time and materials, or even newer, more innovative models like writing the contract based on outcomes rather than the amount of time spent or the amount of money spent. And I think that is the way forward. This talk is more around organizations that are still very risk averse. So the fixed price model is perceived as less risky for the stakeholders because, in fact, the risk is taken on by the delivery team. But in practice, I'm not sure. I want to believe that it's more common not to use fixed price anymore, but I think there are a few organizations that are holding out, and some rather large ones as well, that just won't let go. So it's still important to know how to work within that model.
So if you have a kind of a fixed budget, so you've got a slug of money that they're going to give you,
Yep.
and you have a fixed timeline, there can be a triangle of projects, so the only bit that's variable is scope. What have you found the best way of flushing out scope in your experience?
So again, I recommend using a fixed resource model. So that way, whatever you get done in the time frame for the budget allotted is what you get done. Obviously, some stakeholders aren't going to be happy with that.
But they put some constraints on you, haven't they? So it's a bit of two-way street, really, isn't it?
There's different things you can do. For one thing, you can do a sort of share the gain, share the pain type contract where if the money runs out and you've got to pay for some extra work because the project isn't finished, then that extra budget comes partly from the delivery team and partly from the stakeholders. And on the other hand, if everything gets done and there's still money left, then that gain can also be shared. So that way the risk is shared a bit more. But that doesn't help with the tight deadline, because if you've passed the deadline, then you're screwed. There's no way you can share the time.
No, but how do you de-risk that variable on scope? What's your experience? What's your best practice around de-risking the scope definition in your experience? Given you've got a fixed timeline, fixed budget.
I see. So there's absolutely no more money and there's absolutely no more time.
Yeah.
But you need to be able to play with the scope.
So how do you manage the scope with the product owner? I suppose it's kind of how do you manage that with the stakeholders in your experience? What's the best way to do that?
If they absolutely won't let you do it, like the fixed resource model where the scope isn't fixed in the first place, then you've got to find ways to swap things in and out. So, for example, you might move up a story that's less effort but delivers more value, so that you know that the things that you're cutting out are going to give you quite a bit of savings without costing you as much in terms of
so it's getting a
what you're
backlog,
delivering.
and it's kind of prioritising, negotiating,
Yeah, you've
trying
got
to work out where the value is.
Exactly, you've got to work out where
the kind of
the
line that you can't go past effectively.
Yes, exactly. You've got to keep renegotiating the backlog. Keep it a collaborative process with your client, so that they don't turn up at the end and realize that the bridge isn't finished and they can't get across it.
So you don't kind of like start at the beginning and then disappear and then come back at the end and say, we've run out of money and we've run out of time, but this is what you've got.
Exactly, and that's why we're all here, because we believe in agile processes and we believe in collaboration over contracts. Thank you.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what you're doing. The contract may say that this is the scope, but you collaborate and you determine what the scope should be, given the constraints and given what you've learned along the course of the project.
So do you use things like Moscow to try and do that, tease out prioritization? Or is that a bit old?
You can use Moscow. It's a fine tool. It's just as good as using priority 1, priority 2, priority 3, or laying everything out on a table. It's really what works for you and what works for your stakeholders.
Right, okay, thank you.
What's the proportional part of the QA in your fixed price?
That is a good question, and I'm trying to think what it is off the top of my head. Overall, we tend to add about 100% to the dev time to cover things like QA and tech leading and PMing and all of that stuff. So it might be around 50%.
Yeah, for continuous delivery to guarantee the quality of the development, application development, we have to like automize the QA, the test, load test, or whatever. So is that how does it fit with the fixed price? Because if a feature changes, then you have to change the auto test part as well.
Yes. Yes, that's true. It's an overhead to any change that you make, any bit of development that you make. There will be certain overheads, and that includes changing the automated tests, rerunning manual tests, and some amount of management. So if you're writing a fixed price contract, then it's certainly something that you have to take into account when you're budgeting.
This is just kind of to complement your question, the one you did before. I was actually wanted to make the very same question, because we're working at the moment on this project, which is very much constrained by its deadline, because basically it relates to an event that needs to happen next month. So that's, we need to have the system in place before that, and so that's the really cut off date. And also the budget is fairly tight as well. It's kind of already been assigned and so on. So now basically the variable that remains left for us is basically the scope. It's like, what do we deliver by then? How much do we must finish? And then what else can we kind of compromise and kind of leave just for like after lunch or something like that. And we've just found out that that kind of approach is working out for us a little bit. But it requires, and that's now then, rather than posing the question of what would be the strategies to kind of go around that, then I'll probably tell the story basically of how it is going at the moment. And I think we're getting very good progress. I mean, it's tight, basically. We're feeling the pressure quite a bit. But at the same time, we feel that it's working really well for us to work really close with the business owners, being really much aligned with them and trying to find out exactly what are their priorities all the time, what really has to be left down because we maybe perhaps won't be able to deliver, or what exactly is, again, to what's the really strong focus of what must be done and what has to get out of the door by the end of the spring or by the end of the month, or by the certain date. And we pretty much not on a daily basis, but almost nearly on a daily basis, we're kind of tweaking that a little bit because we're realizing that some things are more simpler than we thought, some other things are more difficult, and therefore, thanks to this constant collaboration with the business, things are getting more or less unblocked, and we can progress fairly steadily. And things have changed. The scope is more or less changing little by little. It's nothing really crazy, but it's working out pretty well. We've discovered certain issues we hadn't really anticipated at the beginning. We're dealing with them, basically by enabling as much as possible this collaboration with business people and being kind of present with them all the time. And that seems to be working for us quite well. Probably we benefit from the fact that business people and the stakeholders are actually also kind of colleagues of ours. We all work for the same company, so it's like in a way, our own customers are our own colleagues. It's just another section of the company that we kind of work for, so to speak. So the physical presence and the physical access to these people, I think it helps. I don't really know how more difficult it would be, like having to communicate with people all around the world to coordinate this. I'd probably, that'd probably be much trickier, I would say. But certainly, it's an approach that I would encourage to follow based on our own experience of how this project is going. And if you find yourself in this situation, is just really try to collaborate as much as possible with business, and also not from the point of view of the project manager, but from also the point of view of the developers. I myself am a developer more than a project manager, but I think we've benefited from having everybody on board on very quick meetings to try to just kind of to steer the project rightly all the time, and not only perhaps just the project manager and the product owner, or just the developer and the project manager. I think if we're all kind of together, we're able to kind of come up with solutions, proposals and suggestions much quicker than having to deal with every single person kind of separately. Also, I think that's a good approach for us, and it seems to be working fine. So, but that was kind of my take on this particular case, I think.
Awesome, yeah, thank you. That's a great story. Yeah, the moral of the story is that the thing that really makes the difference between a fixed price, fixed scope project that just ends up being waterfall and a fixed price project that can be more agile is collaboration. That is the key ingredient. Thanks for that. Thanks for sharing.
When you're working with third parties, how do you go about making sure that you do collaborate regularly? Do you actually physically go to them, or do they come to you, or is it over telephone or video chat or anything like that?
All of the above.
Which is I'm presuming the in person is the best, but
yes.
How feasible is that, and how often do you do it?
It depends. It's not always that feasible. At Softwire, we try to take clients that are nearby, so all our clients are in London. But sometimes it's the other end of London, so you can't really just nip over every other day or anything like that. So we try to have regular face-to-face meetings. Demos are a great time to do them. Sometimes the planning meetings. So at the end of a sprint or at a major milestone, having a demonstration where you show the client or the stakeholder what you've been working on and you show them it working and you can get their feedback. Those are much easier to do face-to-face than on over the internet on like WebEx or an equivalent. But those tools are still there if you're not able to do them face-to-face. Also, planning meetings, I think, are really good to do face-to-face because there's a lot less ambiguity. If you've got a question to ask, something that you need to clarify, it's much easier if you can do them face-to-face. If you can't do face-to-face, then we do have tools like WebEx and similar. And there's always phone conversations, IM, any way that you can communicate. I say use it as often as you need to. Don't wait until it's absolutely necessary. I'm always on IM talking to my clients to clarify little things rather than waiting for the next meeting. That's the sort of thing that builds trust and also makes it easier to get decisions made quickly.
Building on that point, what tools have you found useful in when you've got, such a fast delivery and etc.? Anything that you recommend?
I think it depends on your personal communication style, to be honest. I personally like IM and I like face-to-face. I don't really like phone calls. Some people like to just get on the phone. There's one other PM that I work with, not on the same projects, obviously, but he also works at Softwire and he's almost always on the phone to the client that he's working with. And they talk literally for hours a day. I don't know how they do it. But it depends on your communication style. It depends on your client's communication style. So whichever tool works best for the people involved, I think, is the one that you should use.
So we're in the middle of a piece of work with a client of ours, and they're a startup, so they don't. I think at the time we started the project, they had not yet been paid by their first client, so they didn't have a lot of money to spend. So what we eventually agreed. So part of the nature of the project is reducing the Amazon AWS costs because they've just gone for like 32 core massive instances and it's costing them a fortune. So actually in this particular case it was a relatively straightforward way of saying, well, we can do payment by results, or that there could be a component of payment by results because we just measure how much they're spending now and then measure how much they spend after several months, and if we've reduced it, then we should get some of the amount of that reduction, right? Because we've saved them some money, so we'll take a part of that. But what we ended up doing was having a kind of baseline or foundation of
time and materials.
Time and materials, thank you. Yeah. So we got a standard time and materials baseline, but quite a low rate. So we're doing that at 2/5, something like 2/5 of our normal day rate. So it's quite low, basically. We wouldn't just do that, but then there's the payment by results component as well, which if we don't do anything useful, then we'll only get 2/5 of our day rate. But if we get something useful and after 3 months, then we'll get, I think it goes up to slightly more than our normal day rate because of the way that the maths works. So that was new for us. That's the first time we've done it, but in that case, it felt like it was worth doing because it was good for the client because of the situation they were in. They didn't have that much money. But we also knew that their clients are some quite big names. So if everything went well, then they should have lots of money in 3 months' time. So it felt right. It felt like the right thing to do. So we were happy to take on, if you like, a bit of risk in terms of the not winning as much money, but there's some reward too, and that seemed to work quite well.
Rainbow project.
Say again.
The rainbow project. It's like a pot of gold.
Oh right, a pot of gold at the end. Yeah, it's exactly like that. Let's hope so.
How's that working?
I guess we're towards the end of the kind of most of the work on that, but we won't actually find out whether we've got the pot of gold until we do the measurements over the next 3 months. So there's a bit of a delayed gratification on that, and that timescale felt right because 1 month wasn't enough, if you like. It could have just been a spike or a dip, so we had to smooth it over a reasonable number of months. But if 6 months would have been too long, because they're growing really quickly. But so there's a bit of negotiation about how the time frame for how long it should go over and this kind of thing. So I don't know. I just wanted to say was.
If you've got a day rate of £5,000 a day, then you're fine.
Just increase the day rate. I just wanted to share. It's a real thing. It's a real client. They're doing interesting stuff, but they were in a particular position with money, and it feels to me like we're actually talking to another client who we might offer something similar, because there's similar sorts of parameters, if you like measuring the value delivered in this other case is relatively straightforward. Like it's easy to put a monetary value on it. So in that case, it feels like that kind of payment by results is pretty straightforward to do. But I just wanted to share that really as an example of a model which is like a hybrid between payment by results and the time and materials. It's kind of a time and materials, I don't know, foundation or baseline, and then I don't know how you call it. Like that's the toast, and then the jam is the payment by results later on. So we may just get like plain toast, or we may get some jam on top later, but we don't know.
Is there any agreed middle ground, or it's one or the other?
No, it's a combination of both.
So let's say you've got your toast.
Yep.
You get the end and you're 10p short of the difference that you said you'd make.
Oh no, it's only that's a good point. It's just a pure percentage.
Right.
So we agreed a pure percentage of the amount that we saved.
Just thin jam versus fat jam.
So yeah, we might get a tiny amount of jam, or we might get like the whole jam jar on one piece of toast, which I'll be sick. Anyway, yeah.
So let's try to work out like what kind of different metrics you could apply for this particular model. Not only perhaps as the economics of like how much money are you going to save after these 3 months in your hosting services or your external resources or whatever, but do you think there might be some other like interesting metrics you can apply to that model, like how many you're expecting this increase in users subscribe to your site, or exposure of your business or your product?
This is one of the hard things, right? So we, based on their projected growth, they did not expect to grow too much in the next 3 months. So we thought, let's keep things nice and simple and just say, let's pretend that their growth is flat for the next 3 months. And because if this stuff is successful, they're going to have to be spending more and more and more stuff on Amazon, right? But then that's good because they're getting more revenue and it's a successful platform. So it couldn't be purely the spend. Then we started looking into models like cost per transaction. In effect, they're doing some really cool stuff. But let's call it a transaction, like per thing that they sell, whatever. So the cost per, that gets really awkward to try and characterize, because you've got to bring in all of the different costs from all of the different costs. So I suppose in future, there's a really crucial point. One of the reasons we couldn't do it by cost per transaction is because they didn't have the metrics and monitoring in place to work out how long a transaction took and how many resources it took. And that's some of the stuff we've been working with to actually put in the metrics. So measuring ourselves based on some metrics that it felt like the wrong time to do it. But yeah, in principle, if you've got all the instrumentation in a system, I can say, basically this transaction took this long and therefore about this amount of processing time on the instances and this kind of thing. You could go down that route and say, well, actually, although overall your total Amazon spend has increased 5 times, the transaction cost, the cost per processing thing has gone down by 30%. So you could get. So I could imagine. But maybe the next time we do some work for them next year, that might be something that we do, because then we're able to measure that cost of transaction, if you like. So yeah, and that's a relatively. You've got to be careful with those kind of costs, because there's lots of hidden costs and people get a bit kind of. But as long as you agree what you're measuring and you can measure that, then kind of cost per transaction would be, I think, a reasonable way to do it.
Right. Okay. It's because now I was just thinking, not precisely around those lines, but maybe perhaps about like a subscription-based model where you count the number of users that you've got, and then the count of the number of users you expect to have subscribe to your services in 3 months' time or something.
Right, because that depends on marketing and all sorts of stuff. Like
Everything outside of your
So maybe
control.
it's not that.
which is outside of my control. Yeah, exactly.
So your effort is not rewarded
Exactly.
appropriately. Yeah.
I'd be very hesitant to go down that route if I didn't have any input into user acquisition and this kind of thing. That'd be I wouldn't go there.
Right.
Not like that.
But I suppose if you were the marketing firm,
If it's a marketing firm, yeah, do it.
then you might
But
want to
if
get
it was
paid that way.
something Like if it was something a bit more focused, like maybe something about the something about the user journey that was I don't know, something we could influence. I don't know, something that was sort of related to speed or something like that, where maybe it has some influence. Then maybe there's a component. But I'd probably just do it as a component of. I have that as a proportion of the total amount that we of the payment by results, rather than the whole thing. Unless it's something really clear, like your total Amazon bill, which is nice and clear, which is why we're doing so. The measurement of Amazon bill is the entire part of our payment by results. But if it's some other metrics that we're not in total control of, maybe you'd agree, well, okay, we'll do 30% for users who complete the user journey, and so it gets pretty complicated fairly quickly. But
if you're working on the system, you really need a system metric. Whereas if you're working on the application or the business model, then you can maybe go up to the number of users, which is maybe more of a business metric.
Or maybe perhaps something kind of in between, something that you can perhaps kind of integrate within, like, I don't know, like Google Analytics or something like that, the number of requests that you receive somehow, or the number of but again, it may get flaky because you don't really know, you're not totally in total control of that either.
exactly.
It's not a direct result of your effort. You might spend 100% of your effort on here,
No, but
and it makes no difference into the number of hits that the users get. So you have a beautifully working system that you spend all this time and effort on, and they do no marketing, or it's something goes wrong with their advertising, whatever, and you fail. It's not, the two are not directly linked.
Yeah. Because I'm out of the blue just thinking like perhaps something kind of directly related to your technical efforts that you put in there. Say you've got your website and your SEO systems are really bad, and you go there and say, okay, my solution is I'm going to help you with this, and then we're gonna measure, how much better are you faring on Google and these other search engines, and we're going to run some analytics right now and some analytics in 3 months' time, and maybe that's going to be a factor perhaps to use in this model, like how much have we improved in these 3 months based on what we had just implemented. I don't know.
I think
if you
the crucial thing is that it has to be a metric which you actually
can
have some
influence.
input into,
Yeah.
a strong degree of influence over that. Otherwise, it's an arbitrary metric which can really be gained by or just misuse it, or just there is something that affects that metric which you have no one has control over, and suddenly everyone loses or something.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Sorry.
pretty much, yeah. I was just going to say that if you're doing payment by results, then you can define results in as many ways as is an exponential of the number of things you can measure. It depends on what you consider to be a good measure of what you're actually doing. So you have to be able to influence it, and you have to agree on the measure. Anything else to add? This is a great discussion.
So I'm just thinking again, popping out in my head, in terms of like actual project management and dealing with this, would it be something advisable to kind of try to even apply some sort of like agility on that? Like say, okay, our requirements, our scope, the way in which we're gonna measure this has to be really set in stone from the start, and we're not moving away from this, or is there some room for, like, along the way in the project we're gonna also put up these new metrics, we're gonna redefine this somehow? I mean, would that be advisable or not? Is this something crazy?
Well, that's interesting. I think, again, as long as it's collaborative, if everybody agrees to it, then why not? And it has happened that a project starts out one way and ends up a different way. Like, you might start a project thinking that it's going to be fixed price, fixed scope, but the scope ends up changing midway because of things that have changed, the market may have changed, you might realize that you can't get it all done for the budget, and you just end up having to swap things in and out. So you do change as you go along, whether you accept it at the beginning or not. So why not embrace that and decide, well, this is a starting point, and over the course of the project, we're going to talk to one another, we're going to collaborate, and if we decide that we need to go in a different direction, we will. As long as you agree on it and everybody feels like they're still getting their money's worth and they're still getting paid for what they've done.
How does the contract relate to that? So if you've got a fizz scope in some bit of paper that says this is what's delivered, and then midway through you discover, for whatever reason, that it's not deliverable, then legally, contractually, you're not delivering what you've said you're going to.
That's right.
Do you rewrite the contract?
Yes, you'll do a contract amendment.
Right.
And that formalizes the fact that you've both agreed to the changes as well.
And is that set up front, or you just get to that point and say, do you know what, we need to change the contract?
I've seen it where you get to that point and you say, well, we need to change some things and let's formalize it, let's do a contract amendment and get it in writing.
Right.
But if what we're proposing is variable contract, then who knows?
Yeah.
I've never seen that happen in practice, where you say up front that we're not going to decide anything. But it's an interesting idea. It's one that I'd like to take away and think about and imagine how that could work, because it just sounds interesting to take things beyond what sounds reasonable intuitively and ask yourself whether it can work, and even if it can't work, maybe you can still take some learnings from it. So I'd like to think about it a bit more.
But could you do like a fixed price, like, you know, definition stage, and then you fix price to the rest of it?
Yes, that is one thing that you...
Way of flushing it out and getting a bit more detail, getting a bit more confidence in what the scope is.
Yes, and that does happen in practice, yes.
In this, like I want to share a thought, like in the pre-agile world, I had to work in fixed deadline, budget, and scope projects. So the only variable was maybe the quality.
Yeah.
But I mean, you cannot play much in that. What I learned after that is that agile may be useful for one reason, because we had the contract with the penalty to pay. And if you do continuous delivery, you can decide to abort the project and pay the penalty when it's cheaper than going to the end of the project. We had that situation, and we could not decide if it was time for, like, we didn't have a metric to decide if to abort the project and pay the penalty or to finish the project. We decided to finish, and it went not so well. I mean, for our point of view, it was completed, but we played on quality, and it started a kind of question with the customer if the project was compliant with the fixed scope. So Agile would have been very useful at the time.
That's true, actually.
Waterfall.
Yes, that's something I should have mentioned. In fact, if you're telling yourself that you're going to fix the price and the scope and the timeline, then really all that's left to play with is quality, and that's a bad situation to be in. And it's one that a lot of projects end up in because of that short-sightedness.
You need to buy Matthew's book.
I have a question also. Which agile methodology fits better, like Scrum, Kanban?
Ooh.
Okay.
It's a whole separate talk too. I think it depends on the project. And I think it's good to know a bunch of them, and it's good to not be too religious about any one, because some projects lend themselves well to some methodologies and some lend themselves well to others. And sometimes it even depends on the team and how new they are, or what sort of technologies you're working with, or what your client's expectations are, and how often things will be delivered. There's loads and loads of factors, and I think you just need to know the strengths and weaknesses of each one and understand what you're working with, and even be willing to make things up.
Because we had the problem, like, that for small projects, the overhead of the Scrum was maybe we were not good in doing that, but we had some overhead at the time with the Scrum methodology that was not positive from the point of view of the stakeholders. So they were not happy about that, and it started a discussion if to move to some more like Kanban style, some methodologies. But I was not really convinced about that. I mean, I think that a good knowledge and a good implementation of whatever methodology should help. Do you have this feeling, or are you using more are you prefer something? I know that it adapts on the, you have to choose depending on many variables, but
yeah, well, I mean, when you're new to Agile, then you pick something, you read a book and you follow what the book says because that's all you know, and that's where you start out. That's where we all started out. But we just talked about collaboration over contracts, right? And one of the other principles is individuals and interactions over processes and tools. That's like the first one. So if you're beholden to the Agile process, then you are not doing Agile, because the people that you're working with and the way that the process works for them is way more important than the process itself. So I don't think it's fair to say if a particular ceremony of Scrum didn't work for you, then you were doing it wrong. It's probably that the ceremony was wrong, and you need to adapt the process to fit your team and your project rather than the other way around.